Hi, this is Mahavan Das. Welcome to Simple Gita, Chapter 7. This chapter is entitled Knowledge of the Absolute. Let's take a look at the connection between it and the previous chapter. At the end of Chapter 6, Krishna explained that the Bhakti Yogi is the highest yogi and is most connected to the Supreme. Krishna therefore begins Chapter 7 by explaining how, by hearing from him, one can become such a yogi. In our overview of Chapter 7, in this chapter, Krishna explains that by hearing from him directly, one can know him in full, free from doubt. He explains his various energies, how the living entity can escape the clutches of his illusory energy, 4 types of fortunate people who do that, and 4 types who don't. Krishna then explains that he knows everything, past, present, and future, but conditioned souls who are born into the duality of delusion don't know him. He concludes by saying that those who do know him as the governing principle of the material manifestation, the demigods, and all types of sacrifice, can understand and know him even at the time of death. Let's look at the first verse and purport for this chapter from Bhagavad Gita as it is. The Supreme Personality of Godhead said, "Now hear, O son of Pritha, how by practicing yoga in full consciousness of me, with mind attached to me, you can know me in full, free from doubt." Srila Prabhupada's purport. In this 7th chapter of Bhagavad Gita, the nature of Krishna consciousness is fully described. Krishna is full in all opulences, and how he manifests such opulences is described herein. Also, 4 kinds of fortunate people who become attached to Krishna and 4 kinds of unfortunate people who never take to Krishna are described in this chapter. In the first 6 chapters of Bhagavad Gita, the living entity has been described as non-material spirit soul, capable of elevating himself to self-realization by different types of yogas. At the end of the 6th chapter, it has been clearly stated that the steady concentration of the mind upon Krishna, or in other words, Krishna consciousness, is the highest form of all yoga. By concentrating one's mind upon Krishna, one is able to know the absolute truth completely, but not otherwise. Impersonal Brahmajyotir, or localized Paramatma realization, is not perfect knowledge of the absolute truth, because it is partial. Full and scientific knowledge is Krishna, and everything is revealed to the person in Krishna consciousness. In complete Krishna consciousness, one knows that Krishna is ultimate knowledge beyond any doubts. Different types of yoga are only stepping stones on the path of Krishna consciousness. One who takes directly to Krishna consciousness automatically knows about Brahmajyotir and Paramatma in full. By practice of Krishna consciousness yoga, one can know everything in full, namely the absolute truth, the living entities, the material nature, and their manifestations with paraphernalia. One should therefore begin yoga practice as directed in the last verse of the 6th chapter. Concentration of the mind upon Krishna, the Supreme, is made possible by prescribed devotional service in 9 different forms, of which Shravanam is the first and most important. The Lord therefore says to Arjuna, "Touch, Trinu," or hear from me. No one can be a greater authority than Krishna, and therefore by hearing from him, one receives the greatest opportunity to become a perfectly Krishna-conscious person. One has to learn from Krishna directly or from a pure devotee of Krishna, and not from a non-devotee upstart, puffed up with academic education. In the Srimad Bhagavatam, that's the graduate study to the Bhagavad Gita, this process of understanding Krishna, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, the Absolute Truth, is described in the 2nd chapter of the 1st canto as follows. To hear about Krishna from Vedic literatures, or to hear from him directly through the Bhagavad Gita, is itself righteous activity. And for one who hears about Krishna, Lord Krishna, who is dwelling in everyone's heart, acts as a best-wishing friend and purifies the devotee who constantly engages in hearing of him. In this way, a devotee naturally develops his dormant transcendental knowledge. As he hears more about Krishna from the Bhagavatam and from the devotees, he becomes fixed in the devotional service of the Lord. By development of devotional service, one becomes freed from the modes of passion and ignorance, and thus material lusts and avarice are diminished. When these impurities are wiped away, the candidate remains steady in his position of pure goodness, becomes enlivened by devotional service, and understands the science of God perfectly. Thus, Bhakti Yoga severs the hard knot of material affection and enables one to come at once to the stage of a samshayam samagram, understanding the supreme absolute truth, personality of Godhead. Therefore, only by hearing from Krishna or from his devotee in Krishna consciousness can one understand the science of Krishna. Let's have a look at the key points here. First of all, we get the process of knowing Krishna. A common question that comes up in spiritual discussions is, how can we even know that there is such a thing as a spiritual reality? Or in the context of Bhagavad Gita, the question might be, how can we know that the Bhagavad Gita is true? And that's a good question. First of all, we have to consider whether or not we can actually become aware of that kind of knowledge. In other words, do we exist in such a way by which we can actually know that there is a spiritual reality? Do we exist in such a way by which we can become aware that the Bhagavad Gita is actually true? In other words, is it actually possible for us to know these things? Because if we think that it's not possible, then we can't really further the discussion, because we don't exist in such a way by which we can know. In this first text of the Bhagavad Gita's 7th chapter, which we just read, Krishna explains that we can know. That's the first point. We do exist in such a way by which we can become aware that the Bhagavad Gita is true, that there is an absolute truth, that there is a spiritual reality. That's the first point. And actually, we can know that more than we can know anything else, because we're talking about an absolute truth, something that's always true for everyone. Now, Krishna doesn't just explain that we can know these things. He also gives us the process to know the absolute truth. That is what he's explaining here in this first text of the chapter. That process is called Bhakti Yoga, and it begins with hearing from him. As Srila Prabhupada explains in his purport to this verse, by hearing in this way from Krishna, Krishna as the Supersoul cleanses the consciousness of the practitioner, and this reveals the original knowledge of the Absolute, which is there in the heart of every living entity. So this is how one can know Krishna in full, free from any doubts. It happens by the grace of Krishna when one takes up the process that Krishna himself gives to understand him. So the answer to the common question, can we know there's a spiritual reality? How do we know that the Bhagavad Gita is true? The simple answer is, we can know those things by the process of Bhakti Yoga. Krishna also explains here in this section that hearing from him reveals both theoretical and experienced knowledge. That's why, as Srila Prabhupada points out in his purport to this first verse, Krishna consciousness is referred to as a science, the science of Krishna. Just as in ordinary science we have observation, hypothesis, and experiment. So you observe the world around you, you come to some conclusions, and then you experiment to find out whether your conclusions are true or false. Similarly, with Bhakti Yoga, you can do the same thing. You can experiment and you can see for yourself whether or not Krishna is who he says he is. In that sense, Bhakti Yoga is scientific. Krishna also explains in this section that although everybody can know him in truth, free from doubts, most people aren't interested. Why aren't they interested? Because they're just too absorbed in and distracted by mundane considerations. That means considerations about the body and the mind. Basically, we can group them into 4 categories: eating, sleeping, sex, and defense. Most people they don't want to know anything more than that. So one who does understand Krishna in truth is an extremely rare person. The next section is knowledge of Krishna's energies. This is what it means to know Krishna in truth. First of all, Krishna explains his material energy. His material energy has 8 subdivisions: earth, water, fire, air, and ether, and then mind, intelligence, and false ego. So the first 5 are gross material energies. Earth means solid matter, water means liquid matter, fire means radiant energy or heat, air, gases, and then ether refers to space, or the space in which things exist. So that's also an energy. So those 5 subdivisions of his material energy are gross. We can more or less perceive them with our senses. But then we have subtle energies as well. We have the mind, the intelligence, and the false ego. And these energies we can't perceive with our senses, even though they're material. So this is Krishna's material energy, and this material energy covers the spirit soul, and as we'll hear later on in the chapter, prevents the spirit soul from understanding his own spiritual identity and also the supreme spiritual identity, Krishna. Next, Krishna explains that spiritual energy known as the conscious living entity. So the difference between the spiritual energy, the conscious living entity, and the material energy is that the spiritual energy is conscious, whereas the material energy is not conscious. It's dead matter. Krishna explains in this section that he is everything, in the sense that everything is his energy. Whether matter or spirit, it's all his energy. And essentially, there's no real difference between the energy and the energetic source. Take, for example, the sun. There's no real difference between the sun and the energy of the sun, the sunlight, and the heat that comes from the sun. They are essentially non-different. So when we say that everything is Krishna, we're saying that everything is Krishna's energy, and because the energy is essentially non-different from the energetic source, therefore it's correct to say that everything is Krishna. But at the same time, although Krishna is all-pervading by his various energies, he simultaneously exists beyond his energies. He has his own separate existence as well. Krishna explains here that of all material manifestations, he's the essence. For example, he says, I'm the taste in the water. The pure taste of water is what we enjoy about water. And so when it comes to any material manifestation, he explains he's the essence. He's the taste in the water. He's the light of the sun and the moon. He's the syllable Om in the Vedic mantras. He's the sound in ether, and he is the ability in the human being. So in this way, he's the essence of all material manifestations. The next key point we get is the process of freedom from illusion. That process is approaching Krishna, and specifically it's referred to as Bhakti Yoga. Bhakti Yoga is the process to approach Krishna in the proper mood, or in a mood that will convince Krishna to reveal himself to us. This is another common question. If there is a supreme being, then why can't we see him? So Krishna explains in this section that all conditioned souls are bewildered by his material energy. As I was explaining, that material energy covers the soul. That means it covers the soul's awareness of its own spiritual identity, and it covers its awareness of the supreme spiritual identity. And this material energy can also be divided into 3 modes. We've heard about them in various chapters previously. In brief, the modes of goodness, passion, and ignorance. So Krishna explains in this section that all conditioned souls are bewildered because of being covered by these 3 modes of material nature: goodness, passion, and ignorance. And this is why we can't see the Supreme, because our consciousness is covered from that knowledge. A good analogy for this is how the sun can be covered by clouds. Of course, the sun is so great and powerful that actually the sun can never be covered by clouds, but our tiny vision, because we're tiny and our vision is very tiny, our vision can be covered by clouds, and therefore to our vision it appears that there's no sun. So in exactly the same way, because we're tiny, we can be covered by these 3 modes of material nature, which are like clouds over our consciousness, and they prevent us from seeing the sun-like absolute truth. Now, if you can get an airplane, you can fly above the clouds on a cloudy day, and you will see the sun in all its glory. Similarly, you can overcome the illusion of the 3 modes of material nature, not by your own efforts, but by jumping in the plane of bhakti yoga and rising above the clouds of illusion. By our own efforts, we can't jump up and get above the clouds to see the sun. Similarly, by our own efforts, we can't see the Supreme. But if we get in a plane, we rise above the clouds very quickly. And similarly, if we get in the plane of bhakti yoga, we can very easily, Krishna explains in this section, rise above the illusory energy, the 3 modes of material nature, and see him in all his glory. Krishna also explains in this section that there are 4 types of people who do this, and then there are 4 types who don't. So this world always has both categories of people: those people who are interested in making spiritual advancement and those people who are not. And there are various divisions of those people. The next key point we get here is Krishna addressing those who worship demigods and impersonalists. As he said, hardly anyone knows him in truth. And many people, they just accept other methods of elevation. So they want to be elevated, either materially or spiritually, but they don't approach Krishna for that. They either go to demigods for material elevation, or they try impersonal spiritual processes for spiritual elevation. So what does Krishna say about the demigod worshippers? He says that they are unintelligent. Why? Because although they get quick material results from worshipping these higher beings, their results are all temporary. You may remember in the 5th chapter that Krishna explained someone who's truly intelligent doesn't aspire for anything material, because everything material is temporary and therefore it's a cause of suffering. And what does Krishna say about the impersonalists? Those who think that personality comes from impersonality. He explains they're also unintelligent, because this is not a very reasonable proposal. How can something impersonal generate something personal? We know that a person can act impersonally, like I'm a person and I could choose to ignore someone. That would be a person acting impersonally. But how does an impersonal manifestation or entity become personal? So Krishna explains these impersonalists, those who believe that the ultimate manifestation of the Absolute is impersonal, are less intelligent, and he explains, I don't reveal myself to them in my ultimate personal form. This again brings up the point, or the question, why we can't see the Supreme. The basic answer here is because the Supreme doesn't want us to see him. And why doesn't he want us to see him? because we don't really want to see him. So, as he said in the 4th chapter, as all approach me, in other words, whatever your attitude is towards me, I reciprocate. So in this section of the Bhagavad Gita, he's basically saying the same thing. I don't reveal myself to everyone because not everybody wants to see me. So I keep myself hidden. Of course, if we actually do want to see Krishna, then Krishna is giving us the information here in the Bhagavad Gita how to do that. Basically, what he's saying is, here's the process by which you can convince me to reveal myself. And then in the final section of this chapter, we have the key point from delusion to devotion. So Krishna explains here that although he knows everything, past, present, and future, all conditioned souls don't know him. Why don't we know him? He explains here, because all conditioned souls, all of us, are born into delusion. What is the delusion? We think that we are the supreme. Now, you may not have considered that you think yourself as the supreme, but we have to understand, though, what that means to consider ourselves the supreme. If we go back to the end of the 5th chapter, we remember Krishna explaining what Krishna consciousness means in a very simplified way. It means to understand that Krishna is the supreme enjoyer, he's the supreme proprietor, and he's the supreme friend of everyone. So if we take a look into our consciousness, we may find that we consider ourselves the enjoyers. We consider ourselves the proprietors and the friends of others. And this is the nature of the false ego. And that false ego, that false identity, it bewilders us. And that's why we don't know Krishna, because Krishna is the supreme enjoyer, the supreme proprietor, and the supreme friend, and we're here trying to forget that reality. So the last thing, basically, that we want to hear is that Krishna is all these things. He's the supreme enjoyer, he's the supreme proprietor, he's the supreme friend. So Krishna explains here, though, that one who's pious and who's put an end to all impious activities, that person can perform bhakti yoga with determination and reverse this misunderstanding, can re-establish oneself in their original constitutional position as the servant of the Supreme, the loving servant of the Supreme Whole. Concluding this chapter, Krishna says, one should know that he's the governing principle of the material manifestation, the demigods, and all types of sacrifice, and that one in such Krishna consciousness can know him even at the time of death, which is the most difficult time when the soul leaves the body, and in this way return to the spiritual world. Let's summarize this chapter. In this chapter, we've heard about the process of bhakti yoga, one in which a person can know Krishna in full, free from doubt. This begins by hearing from Krishna. We've heard how he is all-pervading by his two energies, material and spiritual, and how he is the essence of all material manifestations. We've heard the process of freedom from illusion, approaching Krishna through bhakti yoga. We've heard that there are 4 types of people who do this, and there are also 4 types of people who don't. Krishna has explained that both demigod worshippers and impersonalists are less intelligent, and that one can go from delusion to devotion by giving up impious activities and acting piously. Finally, Krishna explained that he is the governing principle of the material manifestation, the demigods, and all types of sacrifices, and that one in such Krishna consciousness can know him even at the time of death and return to the spiritual world. I'll conclude this class by reading the 14th verse of the chapter and some of Srila Prabhupada's purport, which gives a nice summary to the essence of what's going on here in chapter 7. Krishna says, this divine energy of mine, consisting of the 3 modes of material nature, is difficult to overcome. But those who have surrendered unto me can easily cross beyond it. Srila Prabhupada's purport. The Supreme Personality of Godhead has innumerable energies, and all these energies are divine. Although the living entities are part of his energies and are therefore divine, due to contact with material energy, their original superior power is covered. Being thus covered by material energy, one cannot possibly overcome its influence. As previously stated, both the material and spiritual natures, being emanations from the Supreme Personality of Godhead, are eternal. The living entities belong to the eternal superior nature of the Lord, but due to contamination by the inferior nature, matter, their illusion is also eternal. The conditioned soul is therefore called Nitya Baddha, or eternally conditioned. No one can trace out the history of his becoming conditioned at a certain date in material history. Consequently, his release from the clutches of material nature is very difficult, even though that material nature is an inferior energy, because material energy is ultimately conducted by the Supreme Will, which the living entity cannot overcome. Another meaning of guna is rope. So in the Sanskrit to this text, this word guna is there. Another meaning of guna is rope. It is to be understood that the conditioned soul is tightly tied by the ropes of illusion. A man bound by the hands and feet cannot free himself. He must be helped by a person who is unbound. Because the bound cannot help the bound, the rescuer must be liberated. Therefore, only Lord Krishna or his bona fide representative, the spiritual master, can release the conditioned soul. Without such superior help, one cannot be freed from the bondage of material nature. Devotional service or Krishna consciousness can help one gain such release. Krishna, being the Lord of the illusory energy, can order this insurmountable energy to release the conditioned soul. He orders this release out of his causeless mercy on the surrendered soul and out of his paternal affection for the living entity, who is originally a beloved son of the Lord. Therefore, surrender unto the lotus feet of the Lord is the only means to get free from the clutches of the stringent material nature. Let's have a short preview of Chapter 8. Chapter 8 is entitled Attaining the Supreme. At the beginning of Chapter 8, Arjuna asks about several terms Krishna used at the end of Chapter 7, and Krishna explains them in the order that Arjuna asked about them. Krishna also discusses bhakti mixed with 6-chakra yoga, pure bhakti yoga, the factors that determine the destination of the soul when it leaves the body, and he answers Arjuna's question, how can those engaged in bhakti yoga or devotional service know you at the time of death? Thank you so much for joining me today in this class on Chapter 7, Knowledge of the Absolute, and I look forward to seeing you in the next class on Chapter 8, Attaining the Supreme.